Welcome to Organic Livestock Living Conditions, a training for all certified livestock operations. The Livestock Living Conditions course covers all parts of livestock housing and living conditions. It will also point to NOP resources around treated wood and NOP standards found at 205, 239, and 205, 241. It will also look at required outdoor access areas. The course will focus on ruminant mammals rather than avian species, which will require their own poultry-specific training. Swine requirements are also not covered in this training. Upon completion of this course, participants will be able to understand NOP requirements for livestock living conditions and bedding, identify differences in mammalian and avian requirements, identify necessary OSP reporting for livestock living conditions, and understand required outdoor access areas, as well as treated lumber uses when it pertains to organic livestock housing. Let's start by looking at some definitions directly from the NOP rulebook. Take a moment to become familiar with these terms: dry lot, feedlot, inclement weather, shelter, and yards feeding pads. These terms will be used during this training. In reviewing 205-239, a few highlights will be discussed here. You are encouraged to read the entirety of this section of the NOP standards for full details. Whereas the producer of organic livestock must establish and maintain year-round livestock living conditions which accommodate the well-being and natural behavior of animals, including year-round access to the outdoors, shade, shelter, exercise areas, fresh air, clean water for drinking, and direct sunlight. Continuous, total confinement is prohibited for the grazing and non-grazing season. Now, year-round access can exist on yards, feed pads, and feedlots, provided there is sufficient room to feed without competition. Now let's take a look at bedding. In short, bedding must be certified organic if roughage based, for example, straw or grass hay, or it must be verified untreated if comprised of some other sort of material, sand, sawdust, or wood shavings, for example. The next section describes requirements for shelter. If you remember back to the definitions, outdoor areas with cover from natural features may suffice for shelter, in the example of open range beef cattle with access to trees or forest. For all shelter areas, animals must have sufficient space and freedom to lie down, turn around, stand up, fully stretch their limbs, and express normal patterns of behaviors. This includes bedding and resting areas that are sufficiently large, solid, comfortable, so animals are clean and dry. Also noted in this section are temperature, ventilation, and air circulation, and reduction of potential injury as necessary components of housing areas. Moving on to where the standards identify the need for proper cleaning and disinfection of housing areas to prevent infection and disease carrying organisms. dairy young stock have their own provisions in the standards. Whether you use hutches, individual pens, or modified stalls for calves, they must have enough room to turn around, lie down, stretch out when lying down, get up, rest, and groom themselves. Further, individual pens shall be designed and located so that each animal can see, smell, and hear other animals. After weaning, group housing is required. Next, subsection 11 is summarized for cattle to describe the need for enough stalls to be present to provide for natural behaviors of the animals, and for group housed cattle, it describes several methods typical of organic cattle housing systems. There are two parts of this section of the NOP standards that refer to manure management in livestock. Shelter and feed areas are required to be kept in good condition with frequent removal of wastes so as not to contaminate nearby surface water, etc. Also noted, the producer must manage manure in a manner that does not contaminate soil, crops, or water and optimizes recycling of nutrients. Be sure to evaluate your feeding areas, outdoor access areas, and adjacent waterways, if applicable, for potential impacts by your operation. Infrastructure improvement may be needed, and various conservation organizations have funding opportunities that may exist to help with this cost. Now that we have read through the NOP standards, let's look at your responsibility for reporting in the OSP. When completing or updating your organic system plan, there are a few key areas to focus on. Describe the type of housing you use for each class. For example, hutches for calves, freestall barn, or lean-to type structures in the open range. Be sure to describe the square footage and your annual climatic conditions. A map of the housing areas may be used to describe drinking water areas, buffers where needed, shade, and other landmarks. If there are stalls or stanchions present, describe the number and size of each type to allow for rest and feeding without excess competition. Also describe the bedding in use, any bedding treatments, methods of cleaning stalls and alleys, along with manure management systems. Continuing on with more details, in your OSP, you will need to describe outdoor areas that ruminant animals have access to, even during the non-grazing periods. What types or areas exist, and where are they located? Describe the footing or soil cover if appropriate. Typically, these are concrete turnout areas at the back of barns, sacrifice pens, or open areas where animals congregate. When do animals have access to these areas? Finally, record keeping practices. How do you record times of confinement for allowed reasons? Are close-ups kept in a different area during grazing? This is where you describe all of your practices, which will be evaluated annually by an inspector and a certification decision made, so be as thorough and detailed as possible. There is an additional recorded training on allowed confinement reasons for you to access. The NOP standards prohibit new installations of pressure-treated wood when they come into contact with soil or livestock. There are several examples of areas where lumber is commonly used in livestock housing. From the guidance 5036, barriers. Various types of barriers are intended to prevent contact between crops, livestock, soil, and lumber treated with prohibited materials. Barriers can include electric fencing, barbed wire, metal flashing, and untreated lumber. A barrier could be used to prevent contact between organic livestock and the treated lumber posts or poles in a barn used to house livestock, for example. If a barrier will not sufficiently prevent contact, installation of a barrier is not an acceptable means to comply with USDA organic regulations. If a barrier is subject to degradation, decay, or other processes that result in the loss of effectiveness of the barrier, the producer must replace, repair, or reapply the barrier at appropriate intervals. Section A of 205241 describes the requirement for living conditions for avian species. The standard goes on to describe indoor space requirements, which were enhanced in the modern era under OLPS. It describes and discusses recording ammonia measurements, artificial light, exit areas, perches, space requirements, and stocking density. The standard also describes outdoor space requirements, which must promote and encourage access to the outdoors, vegetation, and shade requirements. It further discusses temporary confinement allowances, which must be recorded and include inclement weather, stage of life, health and safety considerations, risk to soil or water quality, and nest box training, among others. It is important to note that continuous total confinement indoors is prohibited. There are also additional stipulations for manure management. Please review this part of the NOP standards if you plan to have organic poultry in your operation, and keep an eye out for a future training series on organic poultry requirements. Thanks for watching this training on livestock living conditions for organic ruminant animals. I hope you've gained some understanding of regulatory requirements, a producer's practices, and necessary record keeping.